Thanks very much, Julia. Are we on? Is that working?
I turned it off.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
That's good. So I'm loath to get in the way of lunch and mad proper deadly, but I think my paper will probably take about 20 minutes, and hopefully we've got a couple of minutes for questions before we break for lunch. Some of you here will have heard me say some of these things before, but I think they're worth repeating and after the papers that we've just had. It's a real honour for me to talk to you and where we should go now and what should happen after the voice. And so the point of this paper is to get us to think about what comes next. The voice referendum failed, and the news and the Closing the Gap report tell us that Indigenous policy is failing on many fronts. When it comes to the crime and incarceration rates, the health statistics and the number of children being taken away, the picture is grim. Aboriginal people are said to be the most incarcerated on the planet. On the other hand, the assertion of Aboriginal identity and autonomy is as strong as it has been in my lifetime, and this is where I see some hope, and I come from a perspective of having grown up in the region. I believe that the path forward for Aboriginal dignity, respect and autonomy is through an assertion of Aboriginal sovereignty. I should make it clear by this that I do not mean an assertion of rights granted by the law of the colonisers, that is, a human rights approach. I don't advocate that. Instead, I mean a recognition of sovereignty that has existed since time immemorial and which has never been ceded. I therefore want to raise 3 points with you. The first concerns my analysis of the law regarding Aboriginal sovereignty. You've heard a little bit of that already from Sam and Ben and Guy. And I'm sorry that you've got some old white blokes talking to you, and hopefully we can do better in the future. The second point will be to outline what this might mean for a truth and treaty process. And my third point will be to put forward some proposals. I should make clear that I do not speak on behalf of anyone but myself. These suggestions are not meant to be conclusive ideas, but discussion starters. This is a politically fraught area, and some might say that the failure of the voice referendum has killed off prospects for treaty. In response, I would say this is just the time for imagination and creativity. Part of the reason that this has been so hard is because it has been so difficult for people to see what a treaty settlement might look like. Many Australians have an underlying fear of losing their land and the legitimacy as occupiers of this continent. And what we've just heard might underline that. A discussion about practicalities and particulars might make this actually seem less terrifying, more interesting and indeed more appealing. A treaty process could actually secure land and legitimacy for both sides of the conflict. I'm going to turn to the state of the law in Australia regarding Aboriginal sovereignty. So the Mabo decision in 1992 accepted Devertell's idea of the reception of English law into Australia, and Sam talked about it too, by settlement, cession or conquest. This case appeared to overturn the doctrine of terra nullius. Given that Mabo did not accept that there was a treaty or a conquest, then it cannot actually have overturned terra nullius. Mabo effectively only modified the doctrine of terra nullius by recognising very limited property rights in the form of native title. If instead the common law recognised that there was a conquest, then it is possible to argue that English law applied by way of this conquest. Or only applied by way of this conquest. This would mean that all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander law, not just native title, continued to apply until displaced by the new sovereign. It may even be that the onus of proof would be on those arguing that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander law has been displaced, rather than on those arguing that it has continued. So it's a complete flip from the current native title arrangements. This could provide a very different basis for treaty negotiations, and something of this approach appears to be underlying the successful arguments in Love and the Commonwealth, which Sam talked about. And the effect is that it is for traditional law to determine who is not Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander. This leads us to the Myall Creek Massacre. At that time, Aboriginal people were in open resistance to the invasion and carried on an insurgency long afterwards. The lack of a martial law declaration also does not change that military, police and civilian armed groups conducted punitive campaigns against this resistance. The violence was there, and it looked just like those situations covered by declarations of martial law which Ben went through in Bathurst and Tasmania. except the Wiradjuri were a pretty significant group. And I should just say, I've got nothing against Charles Sturt. I just think they've issued us a bit of a challenge, which I'm grateful for, because it might energise us a bit to do a bit more about these things. It wasn't just a riot or a mere disturbance what was going on around here at the time. It was a concerted effort to reject British sovereignty. It was a war. In this sense, the significance is that we can consider the Myall Creek Massacre as being a war crime within a broader war and not an isolated criminal action. To sum up, terra nullius has never gone away. If instead we did actually accept that Australia was taken by conquest, then as a matter of the law of the colonisers, the law that I trained in, that is the common law, Aboriginal law did not ever cease to apply. This would be a profound shift, but one that the common law is quite able to make. The question is whether we are. To turn to my second point, what does this mean for a truth and treaty process? Given that Australia is not one Aboriginal nation, but comprises about 300 different language groups, and the number varies every time I hear it, a ground-up approach is essential to effective recognition of Aboriginal sovereignty. To be able to discuss which law has survived, it will be necessary to engage with each separate group, each with its own laws. This would be the real treaty process, and it will require about 300 different treaties. Things look very different between Armidale and Arnhem Land and between Burnie and Broome. Given that Australia is one of the most urbanised nations in the world, it's actually very difficult for many Australians to accept that real decision-making power can sit outside the capitals. Even so, Aboriginal Australia is fundamentally regional, affected by the disadvantages that all regional people experience, in addition to those that particularly affect Aboriginal people. Therefore, the way forward should be through regional bodies like an Anawan Council of Elders here, able to advise local, state and Commonwealth government. Another aspect is being able to recognise Aboriginal sovereignty. Another aspect of being able to recognise Aboriginal sovereignty effectively is what is known as the truth process. Some criticism of the Voice was on the basis of truth and treaty first. Most Australians did not learn anything at school about the brutal dispossession and genocide of Aboriginal people, and they do not know of the current health and incarceration statistics for Aboriginal people. I suspect I'm not telling anyone anything new here. Despite having grown up here, I had no idea until I was at university and started reading microfiche copies of newspapers from the early 19th century. The matter-of-fact accounts of the brutality were profoundly shocking. State-based bodies could actually hold hearings about this history in their own way. The government response could be apologies for particular incidents and public memorials and commemorations, looking to the New Zealand example. On this point, there is a deep reflex in Australian society to blame the British for what happened. This does not occur in New Zealand, where successive governments have taken responsibility for what occurred there. The British are in Britain. This is the empire. The British did not come here and do these things and then go home, with Australians miraculously appearing out of nowhere. New South Wales had self-government from 1855, and it is Australians who perpetuated most of the atrocities. It was only from that time that the idea of terra nullius becomes actually fixed in the case law. The Australian Constitution too was based on a profoundly racist conception of this country. It makes no sense then to speak of decolonisation in Australia as long as most Australians are not Aboriginal people. Any non-Aboriginal people who take the benefits of living in Australia are colonisers, whether they arrived yesterday or had ancestors who arrived 200 years ago, like me. We're in possession of the stolen property, and we all have a responsibility for the effects of colonisation on Aboriginal people. A process of deep and long listening to the voices that have been suppressed up until now will therefore be really important to changing the national understanding. I would not call it a truth process, actually, because to the Western legal mind, like mine, that implies some sort of objective conclusion. There will never really be a conclusion to the listening required. It must just go on. My final point is to put some proposals. It would be of profound significance if the Prime Minister were to advise the King to make a declaration that Aboriginal sovereignty was never ceded. It would bring the two streams of sovereignty together, one form of traditional authority combining with another. It would be non-justiciable legally, but still fundamentally shift the legal debate. This would be quicker and easier than a constitutional referendum. It would also be consistent with the late Queen's life work of making it a principle of the Commonwealth to reject racism, whether in Fiji or Rhodesia or South Africa. Sovereignty is key to moving forward. An argument against treaties is that treaties are between nation states. Actually, treaties are between sovereign entities, including the United Nations, the Sovereign Military Hospital Order of St John of Jerusalem and of Rhodes, or the Confederation of the United Tribes of New Zealand. We have to go right back to the beginning of colonisation in Australia and accept that there are two forms of sovereignty that have been in operation since then: the sovereignty of the Crown and the sovereignty of each Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people. I'm going to pick up on some things that Sam said. Justice Brennan made clear in Mabo that the acquisition by the Crown of sovereignty over Australia is non-justiciable. This cannot then be a matter for the courts or a rights-based approach. There has to be a constitutional process before there can be a legal one. Recognition of sovereignty, therefore, needs to come from the sovereign. Further, from now on, the Governor-General should be an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander person. This should also occur at the state level. The idea that the person who represents all Australians and the Crown is one of the first people of this land would do a great deal to change perceptions of Australia, both in this country and outside of it. And this leads then to the treaty proposal, which is primarily local but could lead to state representation. A treaty with Anaiwan people should be made by the Governor of New South Wales on behalf of the Crown and implemented by state legislation, and it could address some of the following points. First of all, that sovereignty has never been ceded. Anaiwan law continues unless clearly displaced or lost. The treaty is between an Anaiwan Council of Elders and the Crown, the right of New South Wales, made by proclamation of the Governor and implemented by an Act of the State Parliament. It could include things like having 2 seats on the Armidale Regional Council, male and female, only Anaiwan candidates, but an open electoral roll, as these councillors would represent all residents, not just the Anaiwan people. And I note that Armidale had the first Aboriginal local council and continues to have Anaiwan representatives on council. When it comes to land, in full settlement of all native title claims, all Crown land should be held on radical title, by radical title from Anaiwan. Currently it's held by radical title from the Crown. Some land, national parks and the Narwan village, should be held as absolute native title. It's not a concept we have in the law in Australia, but in New Zealand they have absolute title. All other land should be held from the Crown. You might think I'm getting a bit technical here, and I am. There could be access control over Narwan village so as to be able to exclude people other than government officials on duty and goods such as grog, if that's what Anaiwan want to do. Revenue. There should be no liability to pay income tax, rates, licences or fees, whether local, state or Commonwealth, although people should still be liable for GST. And rent should be paid by the New South Wales and Commonwealth governments for Crown land on an annual basis to the Land Council or the Council of Elders. I think the financial side of it is fundamentally important. Justice. I think circle sentencing should be guaranteed, and there should be an option for administration of sentence by Anaiwan on an opt-in basis, whether you're Anaiwan or not. This could include corporal punishment and detention for limited periods. I know that that's controversial. There should be a listening process on wrongdoing to Anaiwan, which could sit in the old Armidale courthouse. There should be a direct apology from the King or the Governor, and there should be memorials placed at significant sites to recognise massacres and reserves and other key places with annual memorial events, not just this one. When it comes to state parliament, I'd like there to be 8 seats in the upper house, 4 female and 4 male, comprised of 2 metropolitan seats, 2 for the north, 2 for the west and 2 for the south, 1 male and 1 female each, as elected by region. The candidates must be Aboriginal people who satisfy the triple test, but elected by everybody because they're going to represent everybody. And that would only require a legislative change, no referendum. So what do non-Aboriginal people get in return? First of all, acceptance of the sovereignty of the Crown subject to the treaty. That's still not settled. Secure tenure of all lands not subject to Anaiwan title. possibly a crime reduction, because there's a fair bit of evidence to suggest that when the elders get involved, the results are better. A greater awareness and enjoyment of a 60,000-year-old culture. A renewed focus on the relationships with the land and each other, which I think would be something of an antidote to the ills of modernity. And also an affirmation of our best traditions, the rule of law and the service of the state to all its members. That is a fair go for all. I'm steeped in the tradition of the rule of law. I think it's one of the things that makes Australia a desirable place to live. And this situation that we have now fundamentally undermines that. And with that, we will get a more legitimate and secure place in the Pacific and Asia. And I can't understate how important that is given current events. To conclude, we have a long and painful journey before us, but we must take it if Aboriginal people are ever to have the autonomy, respect and dignity that has been so unjustly denied and that is so justly due. As we should realise by now, no amount of money can create this on its own. A treaty process based upon sovereignty appears to be the process most likely to afford that autonomy, respect and dignity, starting from the local level where traditional authority resides. Also, when all Australians take responsibility for our past and our future together, we'll all be better able to live up to the best traditions of this country. Thank you.
So we've got time for maybe one or two questions, which I know that's, and we've got a question online, so we'll go here and then we'll go to the.
Thanks, Cameron. I travelled to Uluru Karatuchu last year to inform myself about the Voice a little bit, and so that's owned by Ananu, and it's managed by, they've got a board that's got some Park Australia representatives and Ananu. So is that a model for what you're talking about there, and how did that happen and why hasn't it happened wider already?
There are actually a lot of processes in place. There's a high degree of self-government already in Torres Strait. There's a Noongar settlement which covers most of the southwest corner of WA. There's a Victorian process which has been in the news. I think that's where it's got to come from, and it's going to look different wherever it is. I think one of the deep flaws of the Voice was it was a top-down approach with a one-size-fits-all, and that was the wrong way around. And I stood here last year and I said I had a bit of a concern about that. I'm not here to say I told you so. I am here to say I think we've got to do it differently. So I think it's going to look different wherever it is, but I think that's the way. There are structures in place. We've just got to make more of them. But in addition to that, we need a fundamental constitutional shift. So trying to do it within our existing local framework won't work. And trying to do it in a culture where we deny this stuff, we've got this deep deflection to the British did it. Until we start owning up for that, then we're not going to actually be able to make the most of this, these initiatives around the country.
We've got a question from Judith. Judith, are you able to speak? I've hopefully given you speaking rights if you can unmute. Or perhaps you could type a question in the chat if that's not possible.
While you're typing, thanks, Judith.
Hi, Cameron. In my public service days, I was the Senior Policy Officer for Treaty at ADSIC. And we did the information and awareness strategy to all First Nations communities that had over 100 people in that community. It was a 2-year training, you know, for our communities. And I think that a lot of the time now that we're talking about treaty, we really need to look at those, at the training for and education programs for non-Indigenous people as well, because I really believe that our discussions on treaty was one of the reasons why ADSIC was taken down by the Howard government. And yeah, I just think that we should be looking at, you know, this really important education before, you know, we start talking to the King or, you know, the Governor General, or, you know, and maybe going back to that ADSIC information and awareness strategy and that training package so that we could actually bring that out for, you know, non-Indigenous community.
Thank you. First of all, I'd just like to say thank you so much for coming and engaging with this. So I appreciate it. You come from a pretty significant position. And the second thing I'd say is that, yes, I'm a bit torn. I think the education piece is fundamental. If we had, so there's two ways it could go. If we had leadership from, I think our King would have no trouble at all doing this. He just needs to be advised by New South Wales and Commonwealth governments to do it, really the New South Wales government. Would that create a backlash without the education? Potentially, yes. Could it shift perceptions? Potentially, yes, too. So I see there's a bit of a risk either way. Might you get there quicker if you get the Crown involved? Possibly. Might it slow things down? Possibly. Yeah, I take your point. And all of this is fraught. So that's why I gave the cop out of offering suggestions. Thank you.
Apologies to Judith if you're not able to speak. I've sort of reached the limits of my technological abilities to open the forum. So I'm sorry, Judith, if you're not able to type a question or ask a question. If I could just ask a quick question to finish off, Cameron, what can we do in Armidale, or what can we do at UNE to progress some of the ideas that you're talking about here?
Thanks very much, Andrew. And we have thrown this around in the law school. We've had some success in the past with holding forums on difficult questions like water law reform, or a thing called Zoe's Law, which is about murdering an unborn child. So difficult questions. And I would like to propose, and this is obviously up to the members of the committee and Arala and all of you, that when we do this next year, we actually invite our new state member and our mayor, and we sit down and say, how do we do this? The current situation is unacceptable. So if people want to complain about, oh, well, the bail laws are too light or whatever it is, that's the, we're dealing with symptoms, not causes. So I actually would advocate that we actually use this opportunity in 12 months' time to get together for 2 days or 1 day, whatever it is, and sit down and air ideas. Thank you. Sorry, there's a hand up the back.
Suggestion was kind of related to that, you know, Aboriginal ownership and joint management of national parks, because Uluru was the second park in Australia, 1976 Aboriginal Land Rights Act that it came from, and it was been like that since 1983. But in New South Wales, we've got, the first one was Mudawinji, which was handed over 1998, and the chairperson of the Mudawinji Land Council and the Board of Management at the National Park is Walter Thompson, a former student of this university. And I would just think he would be a great person to invite along.
Yes.
Because they've had quite a history of, yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I agree.